The true story of Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. In the rolling hills of West Virginia stands a monument of stone and silence. It's a building that doesn't ask to be noticed. It demands it. It's often claimed to be the largest hand-cut stone masonry building in North America, second in the world only to the Kremlin, with a main building that stretches for nearly a quarter of a mile. Its central clock tower reaches for the sky, a Gothic fortress dressed like a palace, designed to signal progress, to signal hope. It was built with the best of intentions, born from an era of reform and a genuine belief that suffering deserved a better response than a chain and a dark room. It was conceived as a sanctuary of healing, a place of light and air meant to mend broken minds. It was named the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. But good intentions are fragile things. Over the next 130 years, the Trans-Allegheny would become something its architects never imagined. It became a place of catastrophic collapse, where a building designed for 250 souls would be forced to contain the lives of nearly 2,600. This isn't a story about ghosts, though many believe they linger here. The true horror of this place isn't supernatural. It's found in the paperwork. It's found in the budget cuts. It's the story of how a machine built for healing was slowly and systematically turned into a warehouse for the forgotten. This is the story of how good intentions rotted into dehumanization, all because a building simply ran out of space. Section 1. The Architecture of Hope. To understand the tragedy of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, you first have to understand the world that created it. The mid-19th century was not a kind time for those deemed mentally ill. Before the Great Asylum movement, they were society's hidden shame, confined to cages, chained in the basements of almshouses, or locked away in family attics, their existence a whispered secret. They weren't treated as sick, but as subhuman, their conditions seen as a moral failure, not a medical one. But the winds of change were blowing, carried by reformers like Dorothea Dix. She traveled the country, documenting the horrific, squalid conditions and delivering fiery speeches to state legislatures. She and others championed a revolutionary idea that mental illness was curable and that the patient's environment was a critical part of their treatment. This was the birth of a philosophy known as moral treatment, and its chief architectural evangelist was a man named Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride. Kirkbride believed that madness could be cured with architecture. He envisioned massive, beautiful institutions set in serene landscapes, far from the chaos of the city. These asylums would be self-sufficient, with their own farms and workshops, providing patients with therapeutic labor and a sense of purpose. His designs, known as the Kirkbride Plan, called for long, staggered wings that gave every single room access to sunlight and fresh air, the physical embodiment of this enlightened new approach. These weren't meant to be prisons. They were therapeutic communities. It was in this climate of radical optimism that the Virginia General Assembly authorized construction of a new hospital in 1858 in what was then Western Virginia. The location chosen was Weston, and the renowned Baltimore architect Richard Snowden Andrews was hired to bring Kirkbride's vision to life. Popular accounts say construction began with skilled stonemasons from Germany and Ireland, using blue sandstone quarried just miles away. This was to be a monument to compassion. But history intervened. The Civil War erupted, splitting the nation and the state of Virginia itself. Construction ground to a halt. In a now famous local incident, unused construction funds, $27,000 in gold, were smuggled out of town to prevent Confederate capture and turned over to the pro-Union government in Wheeling. When the war ended, the half-finished asylum, which had been occupied by both armies, became a priority for the brand new state of West Virginia. The first patients were admitted in October of 1864, even as construction continued for nearly 2 more decades. When the main building was largely completed around 1881, the facility was breathtaking. It stood on over 600 acres of land, complete with its own waterworks, farm, and cemetery. Inside, the Kirkbride plan was in full effect. Patients were meant to have private rooms and fresh food. They were to be treated not as inmates, but as people who were unwell and deserved compassionate care. For a brief, shining moment, the asylum was everything its creators had hoped. A place where architecture itself was the medicine. But that vision was built on one critical and ultimately fatal assumption: that the building would never be asked to hold more people than its commonly cited capacity of just 250 souls. That was the number Kirkbride believed a superintendent could manage while maintaining quality care. That assumption would not survive the century. Section 2. The breaking point. The problem with building a beautiful, state-of-the-art solution is that it quickly becomes the answer to every problem. The ideal of Trans-Allegheny began to fracture almost as soon as the final stones were laid. The institution didn't just house the severely mentally ill. It became a dumping ground, a catch-all for anyone society deemed inconvenient or unwanted. Admission logs from the era tell a story not of medical diagnosis, but of social control. People were committed for an astonishing array of conditions that appear in asylum records of the time. Women were particularly vulnerable. A husband could have his wife committed for things like novel reading, domestic trouble, or laziness. The asylum took in alcoholics, people with epilepsy, the elderly with dementia, and those simply suffering from grief. It became a warehouse for the poor, the difficult, and the destitute. The population began to swell, not because of some sudden epidemic of madness, but because it was the only option society was willing to pay for. The numbers tell the story of a slow-motion disaster. Designed for 250, the hospital held over 700 patients by 1880, around the time the main structure was finally considered complete. The system was already strained to nearly 3 times its intended capacity. The carefully designed wards were becoming dangerously crowded, and the staff found themselves spending more time managing crowds than healing patients. But this was just the beginning. By 1938, the population had skyrocketed to over 1,600. The state, facing economic pressures, just kept sending more people to Weston. The institution was no longer therapeutic. It was purely custodial. Its purpose shifted from healing to containment. The absolute breaking point came in the 1950s. At its peak, the hospital held an estimated 2,400 to 2,600 human beings. That is nearly 10 times its original design capacity. It's hard to truly grasp what that number means on a human level. It represents a total collapse. Imagine the physics of it. When a space designed for 250 holds 2,400, the first thing to vanish is privacy. Beds were crammed into every available space. Day rooms, hallways, even offices. Eventually, there weren't even enough beds, and patients were forced to sleep on cold floors. The next thing to go is sanitation. The plumbing was overwhelmed. Bathrooms became sources of filth and disease. Hygiene, a cornerstone of the Kirkbride philosophy, became an impossible luxury. Then, sleep becomes impossible. The constant noise, the slamming of doors, the echoes of cries in the long stone corridors. It created an environment of perpetual stress and anxiety. And in that environment, conflict is inevitable. Patient-on-patient violence became a constant threat. Overwhelmed staff, unable to provide therapy, resorted to the only tool they had left: control. It created a vicious cycle. Overcrowding led to stress, stress led to aggression, and aggression led to harsher restraints, ensuring that recovery was impossible and contributing further to the overcrowding. The system began to create the very symptoms it claimed to be treating. The once beautiful architecture, designed to let in light and air, was now a trap. The long, elegant hallways became crowded, dangerous thoroughfares. The fortress of hope had become a prison of despair. The horror wasn't caused by a few evil doctors. It was the inevitable output of a system pushed past its breaking point and abandoned by the society it served. Section 3. Dehumanization and despair. When a hospital runs out of space, it loses care, then privacy, then dignity, then names. It stops being a hospital and starts being a human storage facility. By the mid-20th century, Trans-Allegheny, by then renamed Weston State Hospital, had descended into a nightmare. An investigation by the Charleston Gazette in 1949 famously described the asylum as a hog pen, detailing unimaginable filth and neglect. It found patients living in their own waste and being managed by a staff that was hopelessly outnumbered. One report from the era claimed the patient-to-doctor ratio was a staggering 248 to 1. In this chaos, treatment took on a brutal character. Moral therapy was a distant memory, replaced by methods designed for control. Hydrotherapy, once intended to be soothing, became a punishment where patients were submerged in ice water baths. Electric shock therapy was used, often without anesthesia, to manage unruly patients. But no treatment is more infamous than the lobotomy. In the 1950s, Dr. Walter Freeman, the evangelist of the ice pick lobotomy, brought his crusade to West Virginia. As part of a tour that has since been dubbed the West Virginia Lobotomy Project, Freeman and his colleagues reportedly performed hundreds of transorbital lobotomies. His procedure required no operating room. It involved driving a sharp instrument through the patient's eye socket with a mallet to sever connections in the brain's frontal lobe. The procedure was fast, crude, and irreversible. At Weston, patients considered difficult were subjected to this procedure, which often left them in a passive or childlike state. It was the ultimate tool of control, sold as a cure. The overcrowding also led to horrifying violence. According to hospital lore, there were multiple patient-on-patient murders. One infamous story tells of two patients who hanged another with bed sheets, and when the sheets broke, they crushed his head with a metal bed frame. Staff were also in danger. In another often told story, a nurse who disappeared was presumed to have quit her job, but her body was discovered 2 months later at the bottom of an unused staircase. The building itself became an engine for the erasure of human identity. Once you were admitted, getting out was nearly impossible. A person was reduced to a name on a chart, a bed number, a ward classification. Families were often discouraged from visiting, severing the last ties to the outside world. People were lost in the system for decades. One reported story is of a man who spent 60 years of his life inside the asylum. When it finally closed, he was in tears, not wanting to leave the only home he had ever known. He died just a few weeks after being relocated. Many hundreds, possibly thousands, are buried on the hill behind the hospital in 3 separate cemeteries. Most of the graves are marked only with a small, numbered stone. Their names are gone, their stories lost to bureaucratic silence. The real crime of Weston wasn't just the neglect or the violence. It was the methodical, systemic erasure of the person. It was the way paperwork, budget cuts, and the sheer math of overcrowding conspired to turn thousands of individuals into a single, disposable problem. The horror wasn't that the building was haunted by ghosts. The horror was that it was filled with living people who had been forced to become ghosts long before they died. Section 4. The long silence and lingering echoes. The end for Weston State Hospital came not with a bang, but with a long, slow decline. By the 1960s and 70s, a new movement was gaining ground: deinstitutionalization. The development of psychotropic medications like Thorazine offered a chemical solution, promising that patients could be managed in community settings rather than being warehoused in massive asylums. At the same time, a series of damning journalistic exposés and court investigations brought the horrific conditions inside places like Weston into the public eye. In the 1980s, reports showed that conditions remained dire, with patients still living in filth and the building itself falling apart. But the patient population had begun to drop as new medications and care models took hold. The era of the Grand Asylum was over. In May of 1994, after roughly 130 years of continuous operation, Weston State Hospital officially closed its doors. The remaining patients were transferred to a new, modern hospital nearby or released into community care. The closure, prompted in part by a patient advocacy lawsuit, was a final admission that the building was beyond salvaging as a medical facility. For years, the massive stone structure stood silent and vacant, slowly decaying. There was talk of turning it into a hotel or a prison, but nothing came of it. However, its historical significance was undeniable. In 1978, the building was placed on the National Register of Historic Places, officially recognizing its importance. In 2007, the asylum was purchased at auction by a private developer, Joe Jordan. He saw its potential not as a ruin, but as a site of historical preservation. He reverted its name back to the original, more evocative Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum and opened its doors for historical and paranormal tours to fund its massive restoration. Conclusion. Today, the asylum exists in a strange dual state. It's both a historical museum telling the story of mental health care in America and one of the country's most famous paranormal hotspots. Thousands of visitors walk its long, decaying corridors each year, some searching for history, others for ghosts. But as we've seen, the true story of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is more chilling than any ghost story. It's a story about a system, not a specter. The villain wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows. It was indifference, underfunding, and neglect. It's the story of how a building designed with the noblest of intentions became a machine for dehumanization, all because a society found it easier to send its most vulnerable people to one address and forget about them. The great stone walls of the asylum don't just hold the echoes of the past. They stand as a permanent, powerful warning about what happens when we run out of space, not just in our buildings, but in our budgets and in our compassion. The true horror isn't what might be lurking in the dark, but what happened in plain sight, recorded on admission forms and budget reports for 130 years. It's the silence of the lives that were swallowed whole by the institution, a silence that is, in its own way, the most haunting sound of all. If you believe these histories need to be told, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the true stories behind our most compelling spaces. Thanks for watching.